Mr. Peter Hain.
Speaker, I agree with many of the points that the Honourable Member for Mill Valley made. And in the remote former mining villages in my constituencies up the valleys, there are many pensioners and others who don't have cars and are not online, for whom rural postal services are absolutely vital. As my honourable friend, the member for North Ayrshire, argued very persuasively, the universal service provided by the Royal Mail makes a vital contribution to the life in remote and rural communities. However, I think this public service is currently under threat by the twin combination of government privatisation and end-to-end competition from private postal operators like TNT. The Honourable Member for Hereford claimed the universal service will not be threatened because it's enshrined in law through the Postal Services Act 2011. But this only covers the bare minimum of the universal service. Many aspects of the universal service are set by the regulator Ofcom and could easily be changed while still remaining legally compliant. For example, Ofcom recently looked at various ways the universal service could be changed to make it cheaper to run. The regulator considered getting rid of first-class mail and therefore the next day's service, reducing quality of service standards and cutting delivery days from 6 to 5 a week. Thankfully, they did not proceed with these changes, but with a privatised Royal Mail, these options are likely to be raised again and again because of commercial pressures, Mr. Speaker. On the 23rd of December 2012, the Daily Telegraph reported that Conservative ministers were thinking about future changes to the universal service obligation, and that an all-Conservative government could perhaps seek to relax the universal service obligation. Privatised postal services abroad have been successful in pushing governments and regulators to downgrade the universal service. For example, as my honourable friend, the member for North Ayrshire, has mentioned, the plans to drop Monday deliveries in the Netherlands come under pressure from the private company PostNL. A privately owned Royal Mail would be under pressure to generate a return for shareholders, and it may similarly want to cut the burden of the universal service and lobby for similar changes here in the United Kingdom. Downgrading the universal service in this way would disproportionately affect consumers in rural areas. Services outside the universal service would not be commercially justifiable and would either become very expensive or not be sustained. Of course.
I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for giving way, but does he agree with me that it's not just consumers in rural areas that will suffer, but also the businesses that are based in rural areas, and in fact the whole local economy of large swathes of rural parts across these islands will be severely detrimentally affected?
I agree with the Honourable Member. She makes a very valid point about businesses and the impact on them, especially small businesses. Equally, if quality of service targets were downgraded, it would be the harder to reach locations that would be the most affected. The recent review of user needs by Ofcom suggested that removing Royal Mail's air network in the name of cost cutting could mean areas of Scotland, Northern Ireland, South Wales and rural parts of England seeing first-class quality of service fall to just 50 to 75%. The government says it has no plans to change the universal service requirements in law for the duration of this Parliament. But that's hardly a long-term commitment, given we are just 2 years away from a general election. Royal Mail privatisation will likely place pressure on government to downgrade those aspects of the universal service that hurt its bottom line. Private companies are primarily responsible to their shareholders, and the public sector ethos behind the Royal Mail's universal service does not sit well within that model. Just look at private parcel delivery companies to see what happens when profitability is the driving force rather than the public service. As has been mentioned by my honourable friend, the member for Ayrshire, consumers in remote and rural locations are frequently charged extra. And as she pointed out, there are reports of £25 phones being charged £45 for delivery. The government says that Royal Mail faces imminent danger and privatisation is the only answer. But this is simply not the case. The most recent financial results showed that under public ownership, profits more than doubled in the last year to £403 million. That demonstrates the Royal Mail can be profitable in the public sector, which is where most people want it to remain. 2/3 of the public want it to remain in the public sector, not just the vast majority of staff. Privatisation of the letters service will also impact upon post offices in remote and rural locations. The post office network is reliant not only on government subsidy, but also on the commercial relationship with the Royal Mail, which allows its postal products and services to be sold through the post office network. And the current chief executive of Royal Mail says the commercial success of both companies is best served by them working closely together. But a new chief executive of privatised Royal Mail may take an entirely different commercial view. There are legitimate concerns that a privatised Royal Mail responsible only to shareholders would seek to sever this relationship in line with its commercial interests. This would have a disastrous effect on the entire post office network, Mr. Speaker. But branches in remote and rural areas would be at particular risk because of their low population density and their revenues. The last Postcom annual report on the post office network in 2010 found that less than 23% of rural branches generated over £40,000 per annum, compared with 70% of urban branches and two-thirds of branches in deprived urban areas. The government and Ofcom need to make sure that the universal service obligation in its current form endures and postal services in rural areas and remote areas are protected. This requires Ofcom to use the powers it currently has to tackle the end-to-end competition from private postal operators such as TNT UK. It also requires the government to consider an alternative business model for the Royal Mail that would keep the postal service run in the interest of the public and properly engage the workforce, Mr. Speaker. But the real problem is that this model of competition under the Act, I want to come back to this point, has meant cherry-picking in a privatised context of the most profitable parts of Royal Mail's business, relying, for example, taking the profitable parts, like business mail, sorting it, and then delivering it to other city centres, but dumping it back into the Royal Mail network for delivery to the most remote and costly rural areas. And that imposes a double burden on the Royal Mail, taking revenue away and then forcing it to bear the extra cost. TNT's stated aim is to increase their end-to-end operations over the next 5 years to a workforce of approximately 20,000 and to deliver business post to doorsteps across the UK, the most profitable post, that is. Evidence from CW Communication Workers Union members in the trial areas of London is that postal volumes of Royal Mail have been materially affected in these areas because of this competition. Loss of revenues on the scale TNT is working towards would have very, very serious consequences for Royal Mail. It means Royal Mail missing out on the most profitable business that would usually subsidise the high cost of delivering to remote and rural locations. Unchecked competition like this places the current universal service under significant threat, of course.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful indeed to the right honourable gentleman for allowing me to intervene on him. It may come as a surprise to him to learn that, in fact, I agree with every word he has said. It may not have been in the past when he was the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, but on this occasion I do. I think it would strengthen the argument that is being made this afternoon if, in fact, the right honourable gentleman and his colleagues could just throw a little bit of light on the last sentence, really, in the motion before us this afternoon. It calls on the government to provide more concrete long-term protections for postal services in rural areas. Could the right honourable gentleman just take a few moments to just throw some light on that and explain what the concrete long-term protections for postal services in rural areas would be introduced if there were a Labour government in 2015? That would be enormously helpful.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady, and I mostly agree with her, even when I was Secretary of State, by the way, even if she didn't agree with me, but there we are. I would want to see the next Labour government, elected in 2015, ensure that the competition regime was fair and that Ofcom regulated the market to ensure that competitors did not cherry-pick the most profitable parts of the business. It's quite an easy thing to do, but it has to be driven ultimately by government policy. Mr. Speaker, Royal Mail needs a level playing field where its competitors also have an obligation to deliver up remote Welsh mountains or the Scottish Highlands, the Scottish Islands or Yorkshire Dales. That's why Ofcom must use the powers it already has to introduce general service conditions, GUSCs, on competitors like TNT, which provide services which fall within the scope of the universal service. GUSCs do not require legislative change or ministerial approval and provide the best option for intervention on cherry picking in the short term, requiring Royal Mail's competitors to deliver a minimum area of geographic coverage for a specified number of delivery days and to a representative proportion of the population would go some way to ensuring competition was on much fairer terms. Ofcom could also seek to introduce a universal service compensation fund through which rival postal operators compensate Royal Mail for the costs of providing the universal service. Similar support funds are being established in a number of other European countries to ensure the long-term viability of the universal service, Mr. Speaker. Running Royal Mail as a not-for-profit dividend company, like, for example, Welsh Water, would provide a suitable alternative model, and that's entirely compatible with the 2011 Act. The government could actually choose that model, and I urge it to do so. Royal Mail's recent profitability shows that it could raise investment capital through its own profits, and this is a step towards becoming a self-financing, not-for-dividend company under the Act. Without changing ownership, Royal Mail could borrow from money markets at a cheaper rate, like Welsh Water, even within the 2011 Act. That would be a much, much better model for protecting rural postal services. Mr. Speaker, otherwise I fear the future is an end to door-to-door delivery in remote rural areas and the appearance of personal letterboxes in village centres, with the post office network all but disappearing.
Well done. Hear, hear.